Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, salam. Welcome everybody to MACFEST 2026, to an incredible panel, a 12th century novel. It's part of the Words and Books Festival, one of the nine mini festivals that MACFEST is hosting every year. As I said, it's an international panel. We would like to know where you're sitting in the world. Say hello in the chat, don't be shy. Let us know where you're watching us from. And if you have any questions or you would like to share any thoughts on today's event, please put them in the comments for us or in the Q&A portal. We will pick them up towards the end of the event and try to answer them all. So our host for today is Daryl Morris. Let me introduce Daryl very quickly. He's an award-winning broadcaster and documentary maker. He currently hosts the weekend evening show on Times Radio and has written for The Times, The Guardian, The Huffington Post, and Grazia magazine. He also produces and presents documentaries, most recently God Next Door and We Are Not a Conspiracy School for BBC Radio 4 and Dark Patterns for BBC World Service. Elsewhere, he journeyed into the secretive Freemasons Hall for Inside Freemasons headquarters and investigated the TikTok sleuths who descended onto the scene of disappearance in Searching for Nicola, both for The Times. Daryl is a regular panelist on Channel 5's The Jeremy Vine Show and occasionally guest hosts The Times daily news podcast, The Story. And Daryl is also a person that you might remember from another event, a live event in the past. And I would like to encourage everybody, please connect with us in the chat. We do want to know where you're watching us from. I can see we've got loads of people in the audience, so enjoy today's event. And just very quickly, if we have any Muslim artists in the audience, we still have 3 places left on the panel with Samir Malik, calligrapher and artist. Head on to Eventbrite to see that panel later this month. And let us know via email hello@macfest.org.uk if you would like to join the panel and the conversation with Samir live. So thank you very much, and over to you, Daryl.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be collaborating with MACFEST again, and on such a fascinating subject, such an extraordinary piece of history, this 12th century novel that is so full of wisdom and insight, that tells us a huge amount about its era and about where we find ourselves now. There are probably a million threads for us to pull on here, for us to try to contextualize and understand. And we're going to do that today in the company of 2 esteemed panelists, 2 people who know this novel inside out, and can offer some of those insights. Really pleased to be joined by Professor Akbar Ahmed, who is a Pakistani-American diplomat, a poet, an author, a researcher, and also Simon Guerrier too, who is a podcaster and a writer, and is the chair of the Books Committee for the Writers Guild of Great Britain. So steeped in knowledge, both of them, about this extraordinary piece of work. And I wonder if we start with you, Akbar, if you could give us, I think it's worth a sort of big, deep breath and exhale your kind of reflections on this piece of work, its history, how it came about, and where it takes us today. And we'll pick up upon some of those threads as we go. You're on mute at the moment.
Yes.
There we go. Yeah.
Thank you, Daryl. I will. And before I do want to say how delighted I am to be back at MACFEST. I'm always such an admirer of Kaisar Shiraz, who's the presiding genius over this whole enterprise, and especially delighted at this very distinguished panel that I am honored to be on. So with that, very briefly and very quickly, this book that we are discussing is often called the most important book you've never heard of. And the reason is that it is so significant that it is the third most translated book in the Arabic language. So the first most translated book is the Quran, then the 1001 Nights, we've all heard of that. The third one is this particular book. And yet most people have never heard of it. It is about a young boy who grows into a man. He finds himself on a deserted island. So there's no one on the island, no one at all. And this young boy does not have access to books, so no teachers, nothing to guide him. And he's adopted by a female deer, a doe. And the doe, in fact, adopts him, looks after him, feeds him, gives him her milk. And then, and in a very dramatic and very moving episode, she dies because of natural causes. And that traumatizes this young man, Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. And he cannot understand how this person, who's his mother, has suddenly left him and why she's left him. And where whatever has gone from her body, where has it gone? What does it mean? Will he also now be subject to the same laws of birth and death? So suddenly we're getting a sense of these big philosophic issues being raised. So on one level, it's the story of this young man on the deserted island. He's all by himself, and he has to literally grow within himself to understand the nature of the world we are living in. And the second level to read this book is, of course, the more permanent one and the more philosophic one, because over his lifetime, he's going to raise, Hayy ibn Yaqdhan is going to raise some very deep philosophic issues, which in a very dramatic sense make this novel a very modern novel. So either he's going to raise issues of what is man's relationship with the divine, what is man's relationship with each other in terms of society, how are you going to deal with the laws and the methods of governance, what is the debate on the nature of God himself, is there a God, is there no God, and how do you deal with someone who you don't agree with, because eventually there'll be an individual called Absal who turn up on this island, and the two of them, Hayy, who's on the island originally, and Absal, become friends. And they have long debates, philosophic debates. And here again, Hayy's nature comes through, shining through, where he talks about the need to talk and discuss and have a dialogue rather than to be violent or use force. So you'll not come across any more Hollywood kind of depictions of islands. You won't have pirates and you won't have cannibals, or none of that, because Hayy is looking at nature, the stars, the consistency of the stars, the waves in the ocean, the rustling of the leaves and the branches. And he comes to the conclusion that all this nature around us it has an order, and something runs that, something has created that order. And there cannot be any violence or incompatibility between the creator of all this and himself, who's the creation. So the compatibility, the benevolent compatibility of creation and creator is very important. And finally, this is just to give you a thumbnail sketch of the plot. The impact of this novel has been incredible. So literally up to our time. So you've got, for example, one of the famous examples, The Jungle Book with Mowgli, Rudyard Kipling's famous novel. Now, Mowgli, as we know, is brought up by a she-wolf. Hayy has been brought up by a doe, a female deer. Many, many similarities. Then you have the Tarzan comics, Edgar Rice Burroughs. Tarzan, he grows up, he finds himself in the jungle in Africa somewhere, and he's brought up by a she-gorilla. So some similarities there. And then, of course, Robinson Crusoe is one of the dramatic examples of the influence, perhaps directly, perhaps indirectly. But Robinson Crusoe, as we know, is on an island. He's got to answers some of these questions on his own, and then he meets Friday. Now, there's a slight difference here because Robinson Crusoe, while he has affection for Friday, does treat him in a, I would say, neo-colonial fashion. So he first of all establishes that he must be addressed as the master with a capital M. So all of a sudden you have hierarchy. Now, in contrast, Ḥayy and Absal, the man who visits him from the neighboring island, are colleagues, and in the end become good friends with mutual respect. So you have all sorts of impact of this novel on other cultures and other novels, and also some of the more contemporary adaptations of these characters in it. Finally, the point I want to raise, and we can discuss it if you like, Ibn Tufail, the writer, is not a professional novelist or poet or journalist. He is, in fact, a very prominent public figure in Andalusia and North Africa, what is now Maghreb, Morocco. So he's a very prominent, he's a minister, in fact, and when he dies, the ruler of the state will give him a state funeral. He's that important. But he also reflects the great debates taking place in the Muslim world. And these are fascinating, and this is where I think this book serves its purpose of being a kind of ambassador or a bridge or a link between Islam and the wider world of non-Muslims within which Islam may find itself, whether in England or in the United States. Because this is a time of history which is often referred to as the golden age of Islam. So Ibn Tufail is a contemporary of figures like Al-Ghazali, of Ibn Rushd, of Ibn Arabi. These are major figures. These are giants. There's such giants that Ibn Rushd is referenced 500 times by St. Thomas Aquinas, possibly the greatest theologian of the Catholic Church, who Pope Francis admired and considered as the ultimate authority on his religion. And here's St. Thomas Aquinas actually referring to Ibn Rushd's work, and Ibn Rushd agreeing with him, disagreeing with him. But Ibn Rushd is a great philosopher of that time. And also, by the way, there's an interaction with Rabbi Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar and philosopher. So you're seeing the interaction, interfaith interaction at one level. On another level, you're seeing the massive debate taking place in Muslim society. Ibn Rushd is arguing that you can have reason and rationality, referring to the Greeks and the translations the Muslims work on, but also faith. So faith and rationality are not incompatible. And this is something then the Catholic Church picks up, and they argue very strongly and promote this line of argument. So you're seeing this fervent in the Muslim world. And of course, I'm not talking about the astronomers and the architects and the great figures who are bringing new agriculture to Europe in Andalusia and through Andalusia to the rest of Europe. But you're seeing this incredible burst of knowledge and what Muslims call ilm, or knowledge itself. For example, Cordoba, the capital of Andalusia, has something like 600,000 volumes, when the largest library in the rest of Europe had 600. And the libraries in Cordoba were supposed to number about 93. By the way, my references are from Maria Menocal's famous book, The Ornament of the World. Brilliant book. Read it if you urge the audience to get it. It's beautifully written and very passionately depicting that time. So here we have a period of history when Islam is producing, interacting, and very healthily interacting with Judaism, with Christianity, and, by the way, the role of women. Women are playing a very important role in this time. One of the oldest, probably the oldest university existing extant in the world today is the university in Fez in Morocco, and that is started by a woman at that time, just before Ibn Tufail. The mentor, the teacher of Ibn Arabi, the great mystic philosopher, and he is equated to Rumi, who's also one of the great figures in Islamic mysticism. His teacher was a woman in Andalusia. So you can see the interaction of women, the interaction of non-Muslims, with this period of history. And this, Daryl, I think is something that non-Muslims would benefit by knowing about this, and Muslims, because Muslims very often also believe that we need to draw boundaries around Islam itself. And yet, here we have this period, the golden age of Islam, and some of the major figures in Islam were very happily and creatively interacting with non-Muslims. I think it's a great lesson for our societies today. And finally, we have the example of Hayy himself, who tells us that through understanding, because his colleague Absal, who comes from the neighboring island, is going to say, no, you need books, you need scriptures, you need these religious books that we have, the Bible, the Quran, and so on. And Hayy says, yes, we may need them, but you can also, it's, the concept autodidactic. He's self-taught. And he can say, you look at the stars, you look at the skies, you look at nature, you look at the oceans, you look at the trees and the forests around us, and you can learn, you can see God through these, because God exists. That is the writing, the scripture of the divine in all this around you. So in a sense, he's a complete man, a complete person, and able to even see and understand the nature of the divine through, not through books or teachers, but through his own reasoning and logic. So I think I've spoken enough, Daryl. I'll hand it over back to you.
That was absolutely gripping. You could have carried on for another hour or two, Akbar, and I could have carried on listening. That was absolutely fascinating. And yeah, there are so many tantalizing threads to pull on. Just a reminder, if any of that sparks a question, something that you'd like to pick up on, please do contribute in the chat. You'll find the chat button at the bottom of the screen there. Just hit where it says chat, and then you can, they'll sort of give you the little box at the bottom there where you can input your question. And hello to people all over the world as well. We've had some brilliant contributions from Washington, from South Africa, from Bedfordshire, from London as well. So thank you all for being with us from various bits of the globe. Simon, I wonder if we can, I maybe just ask you to do the same thing there. Just your sort of deep breath and your exhale on your reflections, your sort of top of head reflections.
Well, I found that fascinating. I'm so grateful, Akbar, for being allowed to sit in on this session. I first heard about this novel from Pathfinders, a history of Arabic science by Jim Al-Khalili. And he basically just gives a paragraph to this book, which he refers to as the secrets of illuminative philosophy. And I wanted to know, why has this book, nobody seems to agree on the title. So why does it have so many titles? And is that why people don't know this book as well as maybe they should?
I mean, that's a great, coming from, with your background, I can understand the significance of your question. If it had a sexier title, a more contemporary title, it would have certainly been known much better, because this is a very difficult title, and its translation is equally difficult, because the translation is alive, son awake. So, it doesn't even, on the surface, doesn't even make sense, and you've got to think about it. And he's talking about alive, being alive to the world, alive to the divine, alive to the environment around us. Maybe if he had just called it The Adventurer or The Physician or The Philosopher, we would have said, yes, it's a book about that. Because of the title, which is a bit obscure and throws us off, we are then distracted from pursuing the book itself. But once we get past that, I think there's a lot to be said, and we need, I believe, some brilliant director to make a film on this whole episode of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan's life on the island, without too much philosophy thrown in, but just bring out some of these salient points to popularize the idea of this great individual, fictitious, but nonetheless someone that kind of gives us a hook to get into these bigger discussions. And it's also very human. His mother's death, the death of the female deer, which I mentioned, it is so moving, Simon, when you come across it, when you read it. he's literally traumatized as a child. Remember, he's still a young boy, he's alone, he's all by himself. And suddenly this person that he sleeps with every night and she protects him and gives him comfort is suddenly inert. She's got no motion, she's got no life in her. And he's asking what happened to her, what left this body in order for her to be in this condition, and what can I do by bringing it back? And this, of course, goes back to the golden age of Islam, because at that time, Muslim philosophers were involved in very intense debates about the nature of man, the nature of the soul versus the body. So when you have a soul, and this was also in Christianity, and what happens when you die? Does the soul disappear forever? Is the soul remains? And of course, Ibn Sina, another great giant of that time, wrote The Flying Man. He wrote many things, by the way. His book he was a physicist, so his book on medicine and teaching medicine in schools was used in Europe for the next 700 years. So he wrote a brilliant allegory, really, on the subject called The Flying Man. So it's a bit like Plato's The Shadows, the prisoners in the cave. It's again telling us something about what he wants to say. And the point he's making is that if you took a man, this is his experiment, and you suspended him in midair, so you got his hands tied, legs tied, so he's suspended in midair, and you put a bandage around his eyes so he can't see, he will still know that he has a mind and a brain as distinct from his body. So he can't touch his body, but he still knows. This was the concept of the flying man. So you can see from this that this debate is a very serious debate and being conducted. And here with Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, the author Ibn Tufail, who's very conscious of these bigger debates, is directly plugging in and saying, yes, you can understand the divine, you can live as a complete human being without having to recourse to teachers. And remember, you also had the what you call today the extreme right wing or the left wing, and teachers who could impose their ideas on you. And he was saying you can do it in good faith without those imposing their ideas on you. And there you have literally the contemporary debate on this very subject.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting, isn't it? In the context of people in an era where we are sort of seeking a center of gravity and seeking, I suppose, a sort of sense of purpose and belonging and looking for those kind of things to build our lives around in an era where things are fracturing. In a very sort of new and interesting and difficult way. What you have here is Hayy's story where Hayy has lost his center of gravity, really, and that gives way to a sort of, I mean, how do we kind of marry that though with what we understand is a human need for connection and guidance, and everything that we sort of come to understand about being human leads us to reject the idea that we are just individuals and that we can find our kind of purpose in isolation, that we need each other, we need to we need community.
Daniel, that's a great question. I've thought about this because in the end, when Absal turns up on the island, and at first he can't communicate with him, so he has to learn language. He has to learn how to communicate with Absal, who teaches him. Then they become great friends and companions, and he stays on and he stays with Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. In Robinson Crusoe's case, we have Friday, and I pointed out that there's a master-servant relationship, but still Friday stays and becomes a close companion of Robinson Crusoe. So how do you reconcile this? The need of the individual to have companionship and also the philosophic capacity to develop internally and be able to survive on your own, especially in relation to the divine. I think that you need to go back to the Sufi concept of internal knowledge and internal development as distinct from the external. And the external is, of course, society and companionship. You've got your spouse, you've got your children, you love them, you promote your relationship with them. But you're also developing internally and you're developing internally through spiritual exercises, through your own perceptions, through your understanding of the divine, and through a lot of physical challenges. Very often these Sufis will spend time in fasting and praying and spending a lot of time on that, and then developing their powers of spirituality. And this, Daryl, I would say, is common to all the great faiths. It's not just Islam. I'm not talking about Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. It's very deep in Christianity. You hold the concept of, from St. Francis, for example, his whole concept is very much like a Sufi, or the Hindu mystics, or Judaism. You have all these great Jewish Maimonides, who's living at that time, and he writes his famous, one of the great serious books of Judaism, The Guide for the Perplexed. I mean, just see the title, The Guide for the Perplexed. So that, he's saying that people are perplexed, they're in need, and here's a guide. So these are issues which are very live at that time. And Ghazali, one of the great scholars of Islam, a very top scholar, who's brilliant, who's in Baghdad, who's doing very well. He's a top full professor at a university. And he gives up one day and just gives it all up. And he's next seen sweeping the big mosque in Damascus, because he wants to go right down to the bottom of society and see the world as an ordinary fellow, being very humble and showing humility and wanting to relearn knowledge itself. And again, both of them, Ghazali and Maimonides, both of them understand that the path to understanding the divine is really through an attempt to understand society around them, to embrace all of humanity. And in the Quran, of course, Daryl, I can say with some authority, because as a Muslim, I should be able to quote the Quran. The Quran is very much inclusive in terms of its perception of the world, like Hayy. Hayy looks at the stars and the planets and the changing seasons and the flowers that disappear and then come up again in this cycle. And he attributes it to a divine creator. And that's how he understands. And that's what is the internal development that Sufis practice and develop. So Ghazali also, in that sense, comes to this conclusion after this very traumatic and dramatic period of his life in which he gives up everything and goes off wandering. Now, I know that today it's difficult to do those kinds of things. You've got family and kids and mortgages and all kinds of things. But this is what people who were searching did. When you're searching for something, I don't want to quote Elon Musk as searching to go to Mars or the moon, but people are searching all the time. That's the nature of man or woman, and that's what we are responding to.
And I suppose right at the center of this book as well is a rejection that these things have to be a zero-sum game, right? That
Yes.
That in order to have one, you cannot have the other, because what Hayy goes through is a process of that sort of communal experience with Absal. That's very interesting.
That's a good point, Daryl, because the relationship with Absal actually defines this, the point you made, that he is coming to these conclusions that all this is possible, and he's using his reason and rationality and his experiences. And Absal is arguing, no, but without scripture, without revealed scripture, without ritual, you cannot understand faith, because those are aids. They guide you to get to the divine. And yet there's no rancor, there's no anger between them. It's like two colleagues, both of them seriously wanting. This is the great lesson, right? Because today you look around the world and you see how religions and societies are clashing, and there's conflict and there's violence and there's killing of women and children, and all the red lines are being crossed. And how would I ask myself, how would Hayy ibn Yaqdhan respond to that? He would respond in great despair, because he would say, this is not what human beings, and he would therefore say, my society, including the animals I've grown up with, are better and more noble in their behavior than these human beings who behave in this violent fashion.
That's interesting. Simon, how do you, these kind of central themes of there being a sort of, the contradictions and the complexities, individual discovery, and actually just the sort of raw story of this isolation and what the isolation leads to. I wonder if it's worth us dwelling on the influence, and where you, in your experience, studying and following literature in the way that you do, where this kind of where we see it rear its head again.
So, I mean, I don't want to preempt Akbar on this, but I'm sure he can correct me if I've got this wrong. But there was a translation into English, so that the book was translated into Latin first, and so was read by scholars around Europe. And then there was a translation into English by Simon Ockley, I think this is right, that became, for its time, a kind of bestseller. And it seems that it was a big influence on Daniel Defoe in writing Robinson Crusoe, though, as Akbar was saying, he presents a slightly more a kind of English business type, a slant on the story, that Robinson Crusoe effectively sets up a kind of mini empire on his island, with a stockade and that kind of thing going on. But you can see the influence in things like The Jungle Book and Tarzan. I think maybe in Bambi you can see this kind of thing. And any of those stories about sort of desert islands and people going it alone and that kind of a thing. And what's interesting about that is I'm not sure necessarily that Kipling or Edgar Rice Burroughs would have known this book by name, but you can see that it's kind of embedded itself into the culture. It's a kind of story that they're familiar with. The ideas have kind of permeated, even if the title of the book, because nobody can agree what it's called, has kind of stuck. And the other thing that really strikes me in terms of what Akbar was saying was that, I mean, this seems to be in its dialogue and in its ideas about a young man who is kind of learning from nature what the nature of the world is, and from direct observation. That's a very kind of Aristotelian idea of kind of scientific endeavor, which at the time that this was being written was quite a controversial idea within the Islamic world. I mean, Al-Kindi, the writer that I know as Al-Kindi, writes about the kind of clash between Aristotle and Muslim orthodoxy, as I've heard it described. So I wonder, Abba, was this a controversial book in its time? Was it a dangerous or radical book in its time?
I mean, that's a good point you raised and well worth airing a bit. The Greeks and how much they influenced Islamic learning and how much they were absorbed into Islamic thinking was always a debated topic. The more orthodox would say there must be boundaries around Islamic learning. However, the great names I've been I gave you earlier, they were all very clear on one thing, that Islam is very inclusive. So Islam takes knowledge from wherever it can get. This was the secret of Islam's success in the Golden Age. So Baghdad, the famous house of wisdom in Baghdad, was the center of learning for the whole world. It was one of those great periods of learning in Islam. And Andalusia itself, for centuries, it attracted the top scholarship of the world. I gave examples of the number of books in the main library of the 93 libraries, the main library having 600,000 books. It's just unimaginable, apart from the fact that Cordoba had running water and street lighting, etc. It's unthinkable, because at that time, London and Paris were not even villages. So if you look at history, this is long before even Oxford and Cambridge were founded, which would then come out of the young man that the Bishop of Oxford sent to Andalusia to learn the secrets of universities and come back and start a university. And then you had the quad system, the tutorial system, even the notion of the chair. You have the chair with the little frilly thing on that. This all coming straight out of Islam. The word for a chair in the Muslim world was kursi, and the chair is the direct equivalent of that. So yes, for the more orthodox, taking the Greeks and so on would be controversial. And today it is highly controversial, because we are not living in a world where there's open debate and healthy debate. We are living in a world where people are much more intolerant and not prepared to listen to the other side. Again, this is very much against what Hayy ibn Yaqdhan says throughout. At the same time, you mentioned an Arabic philosopher. I'll mention Al-Farabi. Now, Farabi is equally respected as a main Islamic philosopher, And Al-Farabi takes his learning from Aristotle. And it is Farabi reading Aristotle and understanding, we say something like, I read him so many times and finally understood him, that book finds its way to a market, and the owner of the shop, bookshop owner, comes across Ibn Sina, who's visiting the bookshop, and tells him, you must read this book. And Ibn Sina says, no, I read it, and I couldn't really make much sense. So Aristotle's book. And he takes the book, he goes home, and he says, it transformed my thinking about the Greeks. And Farabi has very successfully incorporated Aristotle into Islamic thinking. Similarly, Ibn Rushd, they don't simply take the Greeks and say that, we will absorb them and make them Islamic, but they take them and enhance the discussions. So Ibn Rushd in particular, he's also taking Plato. He's considered the great preserver of the Greeks. So he's taking their thought and agreeing with something, then disagreeing with something, but taking Greek knowledge to a certain level. And that's why, as some famous American professors called Ibn Rushd the founder of philosophy in the West. And that is why, Simon, as you know, that the famous painting by Raphael, the great Renaissance painter, called the School of Athens, has one non-European in it, and that is Ibn Rushd. You have Socrates and Aristotle and all the great figures of history, and then amongst them you'll see Ibn Rushd. Again, I think Raphael was being a little bit racist because he makes Ibn Rushd look very dark, not realizing that the Andalusians, by the time, remember, it's been centuries, they're intermarrying and they look like any other European. In fact, the Caliph Amir Abdul Rahman III, again, had a Christian mother and so on, and he was blonde, blue-eyed, looked very fair. So, but you can see from the painting that Ibn Rushd had made that kind of an impact on mainstream Europe. And Dante, of course, as you know, Dante, of course, he places Ibn Rushd in hell because he's a Muslim, but at the same time, he places a lot of Christians in hell also, but he places him in a special category of hell. So he acknowledges that, yeah, he wasn't that bad, and he is placed there. So the debate about foreigners and Greeks is very live, it's very hot, and I think it also reflects the intellectual health of a society. So today, because Muslims tend to reject something that they see as foreign and become defensive about it, also reflects a certain lack of confidence. Because Islam, in the golden age of its period, the golden age of Islam, if you look at that period, you see this great confidence of the Muslims. Here on the other side, in India, the same time, golden age of Islam, you have Al-Baruni coming from Central Asia, learning Sanskrit, spending years in an Indian village, and writing what today is considered the first classic book on Hindu India, called Kitab al-Hind, the Book of Hind, of India. And he gives all the classic rites de passage, birth, marriage, death. He gives the customs, he gives the rituals, and he gives you a brilliant picture of that society as an anthropologist. So again, he's interacting with non-Muslim societies fairly and objectively. So it's an interesting debate, Sam, which reflects on contemporary societies as well.
That influence is interesting, isn't it? And yeah, it's fascinating hearing you sort of pull those threads apart there, really, and how those influences move between cultures and religions and countries and continents. And actually, Ḥayy has his own experience with that, right? When he travels to a different island, and
Yes.
And sort of initially he's welcome, but then then things break down, and he sort of almost fails to influence them in a way, right?
Yeah, he's not very influenced by that or very impressed by that. He goes to this society with Absal, says, look, we must go and meet these people. They're wonderful people that I know, and they practice the rituals. They are influenced by the scriptures, and implying that they are, in a sense, very, very much ideal citizens. And Hayy ibn Yaqdhan is not impressed at all. And he said they are spending all their time attacking each other, fighting against each other, gossiping against each other. And he says, I'm not impressed at all by what they're learning. And he goes back to his own reasoning that if you are to understand, and then Afzal, of course, argues with him and says, yes, that in order to understand the divine, you need the scripture. And he said, no, the divine's verses, scriptures are written all around you in the skies, in the stars, in the rustling of the leaves. So that's where the debate comes. And he comes back and he's happy on his own island. And Afzal then moves with him. Now, there's one reference which we haven't discussed, which is well worth raising, and that is the Lord of the Flies. Now, there you have a reversal. So you have kids, school children from a civilized country, England, I think, arriving on this deserted island, and then reverting to a primitive state where they become very violent with each other and they have all kinds of rituals and even sacrifices and so on. So you see how he's taking the same idea and flipping it around. So instead of coming to a more civilized condition, they're reverting to a more primitive one from a more civilized one.
Is there any evidence that William Golding, in writing The Lord of the Flies, did he talk about this book? Did he know about this book, or is it a more kind of it's just in a sort of cultural air?
Yeah, Simon, I think to make a general comment, I think the idea of man on a deserted island is a popular one. It's a common one. So it's not such an original idea. But I think how Ibn Tufail develops that idea makes this particular novel important, and that's why we are discussing it. The fact that he's bringing this whole apparatus of philosophy and discussion of the divine and how to find peace within yourself, or in the Sufi way, or to find it through ritual. All these issues come out of this. I think a lot of people would have understood the drama of an individual stranded somewhere and having to find his way. It goes back to Homer. You have Odysseus coming back from the Trojan Wars, and he has to find his way home then. It takes years finding his way home, and he has all sorts of adventures and all sorts of... and he's again, Odysseus, a great philosopher in his own way, a thinker and a philosopher. And I'm not only referring to the device of the Trojan horse, I'm talking about him as a man who has a lot to say and a lot to comment on the world and the nature of life itself.
Is this book satirical? I was thinking about I just reread Gulliver's Travels recently, and which is quite funny, but is full of things that don't seem to make much sense to a contemporary reader unless you have footnotes explaining this is a reference to a policy of the time or a government minister of the time or so on. And there's a character called Flimnap, which is a play on Robert Walpole, I think. So, and I wondered if there was a similar thing going on here. Is there a kind of, do we need a footnoted edition of this novel?
Simon, I don't think so, because again, if you go back to the archetypical Islamic novel, The 1001 Nights, it was taken on that straight level, surface level. That here's the sailor, here's the Aladdin and the magic lamp and all these wonderful stories, because there was always an element of mysticism or magic in these stories, but not so much of satire. So even the references to the ruler, and sometimes they are not pleasant references, they may depict the ruler as cruel and arbitrary in his punishments. They're not satirical in the sense you're referring to them. And I think that also reflects the larger nature of literature itself, because Arabic literature did not develop too much along those lines. It could have developed in poetry, for example, where some poets can be very satirical and very sharp, and they are in Urdu, for example, in the language. But on the whole, you have straightforward narrative and straightforward depiction of a situation.
Just on the Lord of the Flies reference, it reminded me that there is a there was, I don't know if you ever saw the story of basically the real Lord of the Flies. I think there've been several examples, haven't there, of people being stranded in places and
Yes,
us trying to understand how human nature actually reacts. There was a very specific example in the 1960s, a group of boys, 12 boys who got stranded on an island, a remote island off Australia. And they actually had the opposite experience, where they sort of built a functioning culture. They looked after each other. The weakest in the weakest in the group was looked after rather than exploited, and it was which actually I think lends itself to Ibn Tufail's depiction here of being actually closer to the reality of the sort of human instinct in a moment of isolation like that.
So Daniel, they read Hayy ibn Yaqdhan at some stage, or were influenced by it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, precisely. Just a reminder, by the way, about 10 minutes, so we're going to hand over to you for some questions. We've got some really good ones already, in particular about sort of kind of locations and how we understand locations, and some of this novel's influence in culture, a religious influence in culture, and sort of politics and the justice system too. Really fascinating questions. Please do keep them coming. Just a reminder, you just click on the thing. If you sort of scroll, if you just move your mouse, you'll see a little box that says chat. Just click on that. That'll open a chat on the right hand side. That'll give you a little box to type a message in. Type away there. We'll put some of your questions to Akbar and Simon. Akbar, I wonder if we just spend 10 minutes wondering about where this influence extends. What the sort of what kind of future it creates. And whether there will be in, several centuries' time, similar panel discussions like this talking about its influence in a future that looks incredibly uncertain. And, we've talked a bit already about the sort of fracturing of communities and how we understand ourselves in that, and how we understand ourselves as part of a community, and how we kind of interact with others. That is going to be challenged in an extraordinary way in the next, 20 minutes by AI these days, never mind the next 20 years, next century or so. How does the influence of this piece of work
that's
play
a
out?
fascinating question you raised, a very thoughtful one, and I've thought about it. Two of the most influential authors in the last century, looking at the future, were, as you know, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, written just before the Second World War, and 1984 by Orwell, right? These are two of the many other books written. H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine, War of the Worlds, also looking at the future. But these depict what these philosophers and scholars think of the future. And there may be a time when we will, as a human world civilization, face these issues of dictatorship or highly centralized societies, as 1984 depicts, and the attempt to crush individuality completely. Now, what does Hayy ibn Yaqdhan teach us? What it teaches us is, in fact, that there is benevolence. What struck me was how Hayy or Ibn Tufail are looking at society and seeing benevolence. So they're seeing unity in this world. They're seeing harmony in this world. And that, Daryl, is coming directly, and I'm repeating this, from the Quranic vision of the world. So Muslims who are intellectuals or scholars, and I'm including these great Al-Ghazali and Farabi and so on, and Ibn Rushd, to them, this is the larger vision of the world, of the universe, that there is harmony and there is unity in terms of understanding each other. How do you implement that or translate it? Hayy has given you the example that hear the other side, hear Absal in this case, and agree to disagree with him. But you don't have to go and kill everyone and shoot everyone, as is happening in today's conflicts. So in the future, we have to, as a world civilization, decide whether we are going to drift into 1984, as depicted by Orwell, or have a more civilized world where we can talk about these very sensitive issues, including the nature of the divine, and learn from someone like Hayy ibn Yaqdhan.
Yeah, interesting. Simon, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just thinking about the you know, we've talked about this influence of island stories like Robinson Crusoe, and that idea. I mean, as I was saying, the sort of Robinson Crusoe is much more colonial, I think, in its framing of the story. And I was thinking of you know, recent film The Martian with Matt Damon,
Yes,
which is
yes,
kind of Robinson Crusoe on Mars.
yes,
But this is much closer to this view of island existence because it's quite a benign story. It's about people coming together to solve the problem and save a man's life. Um, and so actually, you were talking about Robinson Crusoe as a reversal of this kind of novel, and then The Martian is reversing it back again. So yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by this idea of the of the kind of work it, because one of the things in The Martian is that different cultures, the Americans and the Chinese and the different groups have to work together. So yeah, oddly, it suddenly made me think that there's an echo of that in what's a sci-fi novel that's about something happening in the future.
yes, and some of these themes, Simon, keep coming up in literature and world literature, and you know we've been discussing Robinson Crusoe, and I was thinking that Friday, Man Friday, uh, is very much like a kind of precursor to Jeeves, P.G. Woodhouse's famous character. So, you know, it's your man there who's loyal for you, like the man. And as Bertie, we remember from P.G. Woodhouse, is constantly giving him off leave to go and attend his butler's reunion or whatever. And at the same time, there is very much a master-servant relationship. So again, in reflecting larger society, maybe not possible today, but certainly 100 years ago, it would have been recognizable.
Could you tell me a bit more about something you mentioned earlier about the sort of influence of the role of women in this story? Sorry, I think we've got yes, there you go. So mute plagues us, doesn't it? I mean, many years we've been using Zoom, and we're all still struggling with the concept of mute. It's not. I think that'll be with us forever. And you know, the sort of center of Hayy's world is a doe, is a female deer.
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier that this story has, you know, says a lot about females' role, women's role in
Yes, yes.
the story.
And again, that reflects the author's thinking and the context within which he's writing. So the notion of what's happening today in certain countries in the Muslim world, where women are being denied any kind of education or employment, I find scandalous, because Islam not only gives them the full right for education, but encourages it. It is very much in the Quran. And the Quran repeats this again and again, this for men and women, the notion of knowledge and the acquisition of knowledge. So you're seeing this at that time, the golden age of Islam. And I find this, again, as a scholar looking at these issues, fascinating, because Muslims constantly say, oh, we must learn from our glorious past. But here's something they can learn. Here is where women are playing a critical role, a key role in society. And I gave only two major examples of the actual teacher of Ibn Arabi, who's considered Sheikh Akbar, the great Sheikh, is one of the most famous figures in Islam, or Fatima Feri in Fez, who starts the first ever university. Dare think of it, a university that's begun centuries before Oxford and Cambridge. So you have these women playing a role. And then, of course, the women in the family of the Prophet himself, his wife Khadija, who's a brilliant, successful businesswoman, an entrepreneur. She's a widow. She's the one who proposes marriage to the Prophet and gives an example of a bold, loyal, passionate Muslim woman who is also a very successful figure in her own right. And she's so successful as a role model that even today a lot of Muslim women call themselves Khadija, or their daughter Fatima. Her name is almost sacred in the Muslim world, because she is married to Ali and their children are Hassan and Hussein links up with the tragic events on Karbala and the martyrdom of Hussein and his family there. And they produce Bibi Zainab, Now, these are really amazing figures. These are almost supernatural figures in their character and in their stories. Zainab is one of the few survivors of Karbala because her brother's been killed, her nieces, nephews, they've been butchered in a very savage way, and she's brought in chains to Yazid, the ruler of the Arab world then. And he taunts her, and he says, "So what do you have to say now? You tried to challenge me," because he's a tyrant. So she believes that her party is going to challenge the tyrant and remind him of the need for justice and compassion and so on. And she gives a brilliant talk, which is recorded. She gives a brilliant talk. She challenges him boldly. She gives a talk. He finally releases her. She comes back to Arabia, to Medina, and starts female schools for Muslims and non-Muslims. So here you have these incredible role models, and even today, many people are called Zainab or Fatima, very common names in the Muslim world. So women were playing their rightful role in history. And again, with some regret, I have to say that today Muslims have forgotten that. So women in the Muslim world today will not get their rights. So very often there's a debate about a discussion about land or inheritance, and Muslim men will say, well, we are the males in this family. We have to look after the family, so we inherit the property. Women need to get married and leave the family. So this is happening today in the Muslim world. Again, it's being challenged by a lot of very brave and courageous women and educated women coming from the Muslim world. So you have this debate, but again, it's reflecting on what was in the past, which has been lost, and it's there within Islam.
And Simon, many of the influences we talked about here, Robinson Crusoe, obviously, most obviously, but even Lord of the Flies, that's a grouping of boys on an island. Mowgli was a boy. We see in this chain of influence the kind of male figure. Maybe missing from. I don't know. Maybe we need to kind of think about that a bit more deeply, about what those stories and about how those stories pull on that female influence.
Yes, I think that's a very big question for 5 minutes before the end, Darryl.
Yeah.
Yes.
Apologies for that.
I think there's a number of things going on. One of which is that this book comes out of a male-dominated society, so it's reflecting in its view of the world, and the makeup of the world, and the kind of hierarchy of the natural world. It's reflecting the society from which it comes from. But yes, it's I mean, I can think of sort of examples of what we might consider sort of pioneering or survivalist women in fiction. But yes, it's a very male dominated genre. It's a very that kind of Robinson Crusoe idea is a very it's very bound up in what male identity is. And what's quite interesting about what Akbar has said about this book and about the Jungle Book and about Tarzan is that relationship with the mother, even when the mother is an adopted animal, is it's often very profound and very emotional. So there's something here that I wish I'd put more thought into about the kind of male space and that male-dominated world, and the role of the matriarch within a male-dominated world. But yes, you raise that, and I don't have an answer. That needs some further thought.
Simon, I want to comment on this, what you just said, from what you've said. In Islam, the Prophet of Islam was asked by a devout Muslim, what is the shortcut to paradise? What should I be doing? Should I be fasting, praying, whatever? And he said, paradise lies at the feet of the mother. So this man went home and thought about it, and maybe he didn't get on with his mother because he came in the next day and said, could you tell me which is the shortcut to paradise? And the Prophet repeated, paradise is at the feet of the mother. He went home and he came back the third day. And the third time the Prophet said, paradise lies at the feet of the mother. And by that he meant that as a person who was given birth by a woman, you have, and this is in Islam, it's obligatory, an obligation to love her, to respect her, and to show her special consideration throughout your life. And that is the best way to be a good human being, be a good Muslim. Now, this is so clear and so unambiguous that, again, Muslims who ignore this, and many Muslims do ignore it, they do so at their own peril. But this is a very widely known saying of the Prophet within the Muslim world. So we have these instructions in Islam allowing us to talk and respond like this. And I'm sure Kesra, for example, who has organized the MACFEST and created this, if you ask her, she'll say the same thing, because every thinking Muslim, female especially, is aware of the challenges and the achievements of women in Islam.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, let's turn to some of the. It's just gone 3, so we've got about half an hour left. Let's turn to some of the questions, and there's been a couple of interesting ones. More sort of points really, and bits of clarification. But please do contribute. It would be fantastic to hear you. It's been such a stimulating hour, pulling apart some of the threads from this book and how they apply. I'd love to hear what you think, even if it's just a thought, just something that's come to mind. How do you kind of reflect on some of the avenues that we've been kind of getting down today? And if perhaps we've missed one that's obvious to you that you think it's worth us a thread that's worth us pulling on, just hit the chat button at the bottom, type in your question. It'll come to us here, and we'll be able to put them to Simon and Akbar. Simon, just a clarification on some of the locations here. And the sort of debate about the sort of position in the south of Spain versus Morocco and North Africa.
Can I explain that, Darren?
Please.
I had said that although this is set in Andalusia, and then I mentioned what is now Morocco, called Maghreb. Maghreb means the West. There was no Morocco 1,000 years ago. Morocco is a modern nation. At that time, when Ibn Tufail was writing, that entire region, including Andalusia, so Google has got it wrong here, it was ruled by a Muslim ruler based in the Maghreb. His capital was in Marrakesh, not in Andalusia. And in fact, he had overturned the Andalusian rulers at that time. So he had fused what is now Andalusia and this region of Morocco into one kingdom. And he was ruling that kingdom and from North Africa. And Ibn Tufail was one of his ministers. That's how you explain it. And of course, it's confusing because Google will say Andalusia is in Spain and not North Africa, and this, but this is how you are able to understand that both were at that stage one country.
Yeah. Okay. There's a comment here from somebody who says, "I can't. For some reason, I've got a glitch on my thing, and I can't see the names. I can just see the comments. I can see the initials. So LH." Says even maybe just a point here to pick up on, but somebody LH says even the laws and legal systems of many countries have been influenced by the principles of Islamic Sharia, whose primary source is the Quran. They say.
Well, an interesting example of this point, and this deserves full scholarship, full research, is Napoleon Bonaparte in Cairo. Napoleon, as you know, Daryl, turned up in Cairo, and his aim was to block the British from linking up with Tipu Sultan in India, who was resisting British colonialism at that time in India, and doing it quite successfully until he was defeated and killed in Seringapatam. This is the famous tiger of Mysore. Now, I'm mentioning all this because when Napoleon comes to Cairo and he defeats the Mamluks in that famous battle, the Battle of the Pyramid, and he makes his famous speech, he says, Frenchmen, 4,000 years of history look down on you. And he goes on to defeat the Mamluks. He then invites the religious leaders from Al-Azhar, which is the most respected university in the Muslim world, and was extant even then. So think of how respected and ancient it is. So he invites all these famous and very respected religious figures for dinner in their honor, and he dresses up in their robes. So he's dressed as an Arab, and he declares, I have become a Muslim, and he's taken the name Ali as a sign of special respect, because Ali, as I mentioned, was Fatma's husband and the son-in-law of the Prophet. And he then says that I am taking the main points of Sharia. And what is Sharia, Daryl? Because, he's raised this question. It's very controversial. In America, it's a very hot subject and a lot of misunderstanding. Sharia simply means the right path. And the right path is prayers, compassion, fasting, caring for your neighbor, for poorer people in your society, being a good human being. So on the surface, there's no negativity in the concept, but because it has been so demonized especially in America, people immediately think of Sharia and they think of some horrible, I don't know what, child sacrifice or something that doesn't exist at all in Islam. And it's like the word jihad, it becomes very controversial. So Sharia has become a controversial issue, though I'm giving you the example of Napoleon Bonaparte, who used the word and he said, I am bringing these elements from the Sharia into French law. So some of the revolutionary ideas that Napoleon introduced into French law, the French legal system, for example, the special tolerance to minorities, the Jewish community, for example, they were under very heavy taxation, etc. But Napoleon is the one who eased that because of what he believed were the more enlightened policies that he had picked up in Cairo when he got back from Cairo. So this is just a bit of history which needs research, because I read about this and I wrote about it, but I need someone to actually spend time researching this.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody says somebody called A, again, forgive me, for some reason I can't see the name, but I can just see the initial A. Says we do have plenty of examples of Muslim women and their roles historically, but it's not currently reflected in many Muslim societies at the ground level. Says A. So Simon, I was just wondering if I could ask you about translations and about how things change, right? We're talking here about an extremely historic text that has been translated into lots of different languages, but also sort of cultures and interpreted in lots of different ways. I wonder how you kind of see it change throughout its kind of journey into different languages and into different interpretations.
Well, it's. I think the question here is about access. So who could read this book at different sort of historical points in the last 1,000 years? And Akbar was talking about the libraries and the number of libraries and who had access to those libraries is of great interest. But as he was saying, you would have scholars or the rich sons, generally sons of wealthy people in Europe, would be sent out to the libraries to learn and to read and to kind of embrace this kind of learning that was seen as an asset. It was seen as a you would be investing by sending your son or scholars out to read this stuff and then come back with this new learning. And the sort of access is controlled because the libraries have these copies. You can't take the copies of the books out of the library. Once you start getting into the invention of the printing press in the variously, but by kind of the mid 1500s, you're beginning to see copies of books available to especially the wealthy, and that's when Simon Ockley's translation becomes a bit what we would now call a bestseller. I mean, it's selling in numbers that would not trouble the bestseller lists now, but it means that this information is getting out and people are able to talk about it. And you could have university students in England being able to compare notes on what they make of this book. That's, so those conversations are happening. In more recent years, you've seen, I've scribbled these down, but there was a translation by Riyad Kokash in 1982, a translation by Jim Colville in 1999, which is only available. It's to get a copy of that, you've got to spend hundreds of pounds to get it. So that the more recent translations are harder to get hold of. Simon Ockley's translation from the which is 700 years old, that's available on the internet, Project Gutenberg. So weirdly, the one that's I was able to read is the one that's quite old and probably outdated, and I've seen people criticize some of the translation and misunderstandings of Arabic and some of the allusions. But one of the questions I scribbled down here for Akbar was to ask, what translation into English should we be reading?
I mean, as far as I know, there are translations in all the major European languages, as you know, we pointed out to Latin, German, English, and so on. I would say that we need a more modern translation of this book, because what struck me was these very modern themes. When I read this book, if it was presented in a modern frame, would appeal to us, because, you know, anyone who's read these great Irish authors or the modern English authors would be familiar with these themes. All these themes that we are talking about, the nuances in society, the role of women, etc. And I really believe, because we are living in the age of media, mass media, you need a major film on Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. And once Nolan's The Odyssey is out, Simon, maybe you can officially write to him and say, here's a novel for you to think about next. And he may take up the challenge. But coming back to women, don't underestimate the importance of women at that stage of Islamic history. For example, we've heard of Rumi, I've quoted Ibn Arabi. These are great mystic philosophers, gigantic figures with huge followings today. Just think of it, Simon, with all the controversies around Islam. Rumi is the most popular poet in the United States. Think of what I've said. So if you go to a bookshop and ask the poetry section, which is the poet that sells the most, they will say Rumi. That's how popular he is. And I'm mentioning this because Rumi's predecessor as a great Sufi poet was the poetess Rabia. I mean, just think of this. Centuries before Rumi, you had Rabia, a female mystic. And she wrote beautiful, beautiful verses. So the contribution of women and the presence of women is a thread running through Muslim societies. And even contemporary Muslim societies, I'm sometimes struck by how extraordinary how well they've done understanding the challenges and sometimes the unfair treatment they face from the males. You take figures like Benazir Bhutto, Malala Yousafzai. In spite of in spite of the violence they faced, and Benazir lost her life to that violence, Benazir became the first female prime minister of a Muslim country. Just think of what I've said. In America, we don't have a female president to date. So this is what they achieved. And just before she died, or I think she was dead by then, but she actually wrote a very important book about relations with the West, reconciliation between the Islamic world and the West. So there are these extraordinary women who are very active, very involved, and they need more exposure. They need greater support. And from intellectuals like you and Daryl, Simon, they need that kind of, and I don't use the word in a negative sense, but that kind of patronage where they're able to be heard. Because silence is a great virtue, as Hayy ibn Yaqdhan points out. A lot of his time, he says, is spent in meditation and in silence, which is a great virtue. I think we've lost it in the age of AI and Instagram and so on. But having said that, by silence, you don't mean that you silence an entire portion of your society, which is women, which is what is being done in some Muslim societies, regrettably, and I think disgracefully.
I think that's a really important issue with access. I think, I'm surprised that there isn't a modern paperback of this book. I'd love to see that. I think it's very readable. It's very exciting, actually. We've not really talked about it as a novel. We talked more about the ideas in it, but it's a great kind of and very different kind of adventure story, really, and very enjoyable on just those terms.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And what have I got there? This is the version I have.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
that's the one that I read.
Len Evan Goodman, who'd done the
Yes, yes,
translation.
Gourmet. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I've obviously found
And
this to be really helpful.
he's also got a video, a lecture, which is online of his book. But we need, as I've said, we need a modern literary figure who is a master of contemporary English to write this with this conscious idea that he's going to talk to this generation, the younger generation, to if not revive, certainly to introduce this author.
Is that to sort of understand it in a different kind of way, or is that just about it reaching a larger audience, or us
I think if Daryl,
rearranging our understanding?
No, I think if you allow Hayy ibn Yaqdhan to speak in his own voice, but are able to project his voice to this generation, he'll do very well. Because as I've said, he's so modern that I'm amazed at his thinking. And yet, no Muslim can actually object to anything he's saying. And there are a lot of hidden nuances throughout the book. For example, this role of women, the fact that his mother is a deer, a female deer, and she plays a critical role because she gives him the love and nourishment and nurture that he needs as he's growing up. And he's relying on her for emotional strength and emotional comfort.
Yeah, okay. And I wonder if we also have, the first thing that sort of comes to mind there is proof of concept. Can you prove that it's going to be, a strong enough concept to kind of sell to a mainstream audience? But actually, you have proof of concept in the countless examples of influence that we have, the countless stories that we've referenced today that influence it. All of these great stories rolled into one. We're pretty much out of time. But if you wanted to sneak in a final question, you're welcome to do so on the chat thing. In the meantime, I wonder if, and we've covered a lot of ground here, and we started with a sort of deep breath and a big exhale on this brilliant piece of work. I wonder if we just conclude with some final thoughts. Maybe something that you feel we haven't come to, Simon, Akbar, something that perhaps a bit of ground you feel we haven't covered, or just your sort of your closing reflection.
I think
my closing reflection would be to use the word, which he may not have used explicitly, but the concept of compassion, kindness, and loving one another. We are living in an age where I regret to say, when I read the accounts of what's happening in our world, I hear words like decapitate, kill, murder, take out, collateral damage. I rarely hear these very important political figures using words like compassion, kindness, which figures far greater than us have in the past used, and they seem to have become now obsolete. So this is one thing I would like to emphasize.
I was going to echo that. I think studying the history of this book, you can see what's going on. Is it's being translated, it's being shared, it's being discussed by people from lots of very different cultures, very different backgrounds, very different classes often. I find that absolutely fascinating. The idea that this book written by a Muslim scholar is in debate with Jewish scholars, with Christian scholars, all kind of sort of digging into the ideas expressed here, and kind of arguing, but respectfully. It's really interesting, and it's not the history that we tend to be told about of this period. That we're often taught a history of these cultures, of these empires clashing, and actually this book is a extraordinary example of the very opposite of people in dialogue. And I think that's in part because of the kind of book it is. It's a book that is a dialogue. So there's a lot we can learn from it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you mean the dialogue of civilizations as against the clash of civilizations?
That's exactly, yes. Yeah. That's much better put than I had it.
And in the end, Simon, I think we should all thank Daryl for a great job, and MACFEST for arranging this session, and especially our beloved patron and director and Dynamo, Kesra Shiraz. Thank you very much. And Katrina, thank you so much for all the logistic support you gave. Simon and Daryl, honored to be with you on this program.
That's my great pleasure. Thank you.
Great. I would
Thank you
echo
so
that
much.
sentiment for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daryl, for hosting. Simon, for your contribution. Professor Akbar, wonderful event. Thank you so much. It looks like we're still moving in the direction where through the events on MACFEST, you can find out the information about Islam, which for people like me, non-Muslims, it's the key information, the truth. In the past, we had events like Islamic heritage in Italy, Islamic cathedrals, again, information that you cannot easily find on the internet, certainly not in school books. So I encourage everybody to stay on MACFEST, join on future events. And also, if we have any artists, Muslim artists in the audience, we do have 3 last spots available on an online panel with Samir Malik, artist and calligrapher. If you're interested, we've got that listing on Eventbrite. You can send us an email to claim your spot. Now, going forward, I just wanted to remind everybody that we've got MACFEST, still a couple of MACFEST events coming up before we close the festival this year. The next one, absolutely fascinating event, will be with Afghani women artists. So you can find out more about their artistic process, about their inspiration. That event is on Saturday, next Saturday at 2 o'clock. And then on Sunday, 19th of July, we've got AI and creativity. That's another international event. Hello from Australia. We hope you will be able to join us. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.